Welcome to Conspiracist.
Hello.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into, well, a really compelling and often debated idea. The hypothesis that governments, maybe intentionally, have concealed evidence of psychic espionage programs.
Right. A big topic. Lots of speculation out there.
Exactly. And it sparks so much curiosity. So our mission today is to approach this with a rigorous objectivity. We really want to focus on the evidence and the reasoning presented in the sources we've looked at.
And we've got quite a mix of sources, actually. There's a declassified CIA draft report which evaluates their own remote viewing program. That's key.
Okay.
Then we have discussions from places like online forums, Reddit, talking about remote viewing, the documentary Third Eye Spies, that kind of thing.
Right. Public perception and discussion.
Yeah. Plus articles from news sites, skepticism-focused sites like Ask Molly on CIA.gov, Live Science, Center for Inquiry, Forbes, Psychology Today, CBS News. A decent range.
Okay, so official channels, news, and skeptical takes. What else?
We also looked at transcripts from YouTube discussions, The Infographic Show, The Sean Ryan Show, featuring Joe McMoneagle, people talking about CIA conspiracies, remote viewing specifically.
Nick Moneagle, he's a big name in this field, isn't he?
He is. And finally, some excerpts from a book, The Psychic Battlefield, A History of the Military Occult Complex.
Got it. So the goal is to evaluate these claims of intentional concealment, sticking to a professional tone, no dismissiveness, just focusing on what the sources say.
Precisely. Let's dive in, maybe starting with that CIA assessment, their own internal look at remote viewing.
Good place to start. What did their draft report actually find?
Well, the report, an evaluation of the remote viewing program, gives us that crucial internal view. And right in the executive summary, some really pivotal findings emerge.
Like what?
It says that, okay, remote viewers showed some accuracy, but mostly on broad background stuff, general context about targets.
So like the vibe of a place, but not the details.
Exactly. They consistently failed, according to this report, to provide the concrete, specific details, the kind of thing that's actually valuable for intelligence gathering.
So not the what, where, when needed for operations.
Pretty much. The report also notes the information they did get was often inconsistent, and it needed a lot of subjective interpretation by analysts.
Interpretation is always tricky in intel.
It is. And critically, the summary states flat out, no information from remote viewing was ever used to guide or inform actual intelligence operations.
Ever. That's quite definitive.
It is. Their assessment was simple. It just didn't produce actionable intelligence.
Okay, that's a major point. The CIA itself in this evaluation saw no practical intel benefit. What about the review panel's deeper conclusions?
Right, the panel. It was made up of psychologists, Dr. Rose, Dr. Lincoln Moses, Dr. David A. Goslin. They had expertise in parapsychology and statistics.
So, qualified reviewers?
Yes, and their stated intention was a fair, unbiased assessment. They concluded that, while yes, a statistically significant effect was seen in the lab.
Hold on, that seems important. Statistically significant means better than chance, right?
It does suggest something beyond chance, yes. But the panel was very careful here. They clarified this didn't automatically confirm a paranormal phenomenon existed.
Okay, so what did it mean then?
Well, they found the lab studies didn't give conclusive evidence about the source or origin of this statistical effect. And they also didn't properly address interjudge reliability.
Meaning whether different analysts would even agree on what the remote viewer saw.
Exactly that. So even with a measurable lab effect, they weren't sure what caused it or if the interpretations were consistent.
So lab results didn't translate well.
Right. And furthermore, the panel concluded that even if some genuine paranormal thing was happening, its usefulness for actual intelligence gathering in the real world was limited.
Why limited?
Mostly because real-world intelligence targets are often vague, ambiguous, just difficult, not like a clean lab setup.
Yeah, the real world is messy, not a controlled experiment.
Precisely. So the information from remote viewing was judged insufficient in quality and accuracy for actionable intelligence.
And the recommendation?
They recommended against continuing to use remote viewing in intelligence operations.
So their own expert panel said stop, basically for practical reasons. Did the report also mention issues with the research methods themselves?
Oh, yes, definitely. It highlighted several methodological problems that came up in reviews of the research. They really stressed the need for careful planning, rigorous execution in these experiments.
What kind of problems?
Things like potential contact between the viewer and the target info.
Yeah.
How secure was the target info after the viewing? Did judges get access to response keys before judging? Were the targets and decoys appropriate? Duplicate target sets, clear stopping rules for trials.
Sounds like basic scientific controls they were worried about, making sure there were no conventional explanations, no cheating or cues.
Exactly. And also, critically, not throwing out data just because a trial didn't look good. You have to include everything. The report goes into the SAI experiment specifically. 10 experiments designed to answer questions about psychic functioning, building on earlier SRI work. The review team had all the SRI data, too.
Okay, and what did they find about consistency in those SAI experiments? Was remote viewing replicable?
Well, they noted some individuals seemed to show similar effect sizes across different experiments, but overall across the board, the consistency wasn't exceptional. And the panel suggested that, well, maybe methodological issues could explain even the consistency they did see.
So not a robustly demonstrated ability across the board. And specific weaknesses in the SAI experiments, too.
Yes, a key concern was information control, preventing accidental cueing. They gave an example. Experiment 1. Viewers mailed their original responses to the lead investigator, who then compared them to the targets.
Ah, I see. That investigator connection could introduce bias, even unintentionally.
That was the concern raised by the panel, yeah. It's subtle, but potentially significant.
So, considering all this, the inconsistency, the methodological worries, what was the final verdict in the report on whether remote viewing was actually useful for the government?
Pretty unambiguous. Even if you accept anomalous cognition might be possible, its practical use for intel, highly questionable because of the limitations in accuracy, reliability, especially for specific details.
It just wasn't consistently accurate enough.
Right. Not a reliable source for crucial intelligence. That was the takeaway.
So the main conclusion of this internal CIA report is a strong no on using remote viewing operationally.
Absolutely. It concludes that while anomalous cognition might have been shown in the lab, it couldn't be reliably used for intel gathering. And it even floats the idea that positive results might just be fraud or bad experiments.
That internal assessment is a really significant piece when you're considering claims that a successful program was hidden.
It really is. It provides a strong counter-narrative, doesn't it? That maybe what was shut down wasn't some amazing secret weapon, but something that just didn't work well enough.
Okay, that sets a baseline from the inside. Now, let's pivot to the outside view. What about skeptical communities? Online discussions, skeptic websites. What's their take?
Well, a really common argument you see is that the people pushing psychic espionage just haven't provided clear, solid evidence or statistical baselines to back up success claims.
Meaning?
Like in Reddit threads about remote viewing, people often ask, what's the actual probability of getting this result by pure chance? Without that baseline, how do you know it's psychic?
It's that fundamental benchmark question, lucky guess versus psychic hit.
Exactly. Skeptics also hammer on the methodologies in the experiments, suggesting they were flawed, which means any calculated success rates might be meaningless anyway.
So bad science can't produce reliable proof.
That's the core assertion. Despite all the studies, the government programs like Stargate, there's still no verifiable scientific proof for remote viewing or other psychic powers. That's the skeptical position.
And the language gets pretty blunt sometimes.
Oh yeah. Some call Project Stargate a farce. They argue it's been debunked repeatedly by rigorous science, and that information refuting the claims is easy to find.
What about the shutdown of Stargate? How do skeptics interpret that?
They see it as pretty straightforward evidence that it just wasn't useful. It didn't deliver valuable intelligence, which lines up perfectly with that CIA report we just discussed.
So the internal assessment and the external skeptical view kind of align on the lack of practical results.
They do seem to converge there. Skeptics also often bring up the early SRI research, Targ and Puthoff's work, which proponents often cite.
Right, the foundational stuff.
Yeah, but skeptics point to evidence suggesting subtle sensory cues were a big factor in those early successes. Unintentional hints given to the viewers.
Ah, the clever Hans effect, potentially.
Sort of, yeah. They say when better controls were put in place to block those cues, the results dropped down to chance levels.
Implying it wasn't psychic ability, but picking up on normal sensory information, however subtle.
That's the argument. And there's another pragmatic point skeptics often raise.
Which is?
If remote viewing really worked as well as some claim, like one commenter said, if it was literally magic, wouldn't government still be pouring money into it?
It's a fair question. A game-changing intel tool would probably be a huge priority.
Exactly. Now, some argue maybe it is still used covertly, But the lack of obvious large-scale funding or acknowledged use makes skeptics doubt that.
Okay. And what about things like the documentary Third Eye Spies?
Yeah.
How does that fit into the skeptical viewpoint?
Generally, skeptics see documentaries like that as relying on anecdotes and personal stories, not hard scientific proof.
Testimonials versus data.
Right. They argue there's just no peer-reviewed replicable science to back up the kind of phenomena shown in those films.
So the overall skeptical view seems to be unsubstantiated claims, weak methods, and ultimately a failure to deliver reliable intelligence. That's why these programs ended.
That sums up the core skeptical arguments pretty well. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what about the CIA's official public stance? You mentioned the Ask Molly section on their website. How do they present this history?
Well, it shows a degree of transparency, actually. They state clearly that Congress asked them to review and declassify records on their psychic research program. And they did it.
They acknowledged the request and complied.
Yes. And they emphasized they worked with the DIA and the Army to gather all the relevant documents.
Right.
And then they put the entire collection online, publicly accessible on CIA.gov in the FOIA reading room.
The whole collection. That's quite open. Seems counterintuitive if you're trying to hide a successful ongoing program, doesn't it?
It certainly raises questions about that narrative, yeah.
Yeah.
Why declassify so much related material? They even point people to a specific article in their Declassified Studies in Intelligence journal, Parapsychology and Intelligence, by Kenneth Kress. They say it summarizes the program.
So they're not just dumping files, they're guiding people to summaries too.
Right. This kind of proactive declassification and public information effort really seems to run counter to the idea of hiding some amazing working psychic tool.
It suggests maybe they're comfortable letting the records show what they found, which, based on their own report, wasn't a resounding success. Okay, interesting angle. Now, briefly, some people connect psychic stuff to other darker CIA history, right? Like MKUltra.
Yes, that connection does get made. The infographic show, for instance, covered historical CIA mind control experiments, MKUltra, Artichoke, Bluebird, and related controversies, like Frank Olson's death, incidents in France.
And the thinking is, if they did that in secret, maybe they're hiding psychic espionage secrets too.
That's often the implication. That history of secrecy and, frankly, unethical research fuels suspicion about other potential covert activities.
But it's not direct evidence about psychic programs themselves.
Exactly. Our focus here is evaluating the psychic espionage claims based on the specific sources. While MKUltra shows past CIA involvement in weird, ethically troubling research, it doesn't automatically prove psychic spying was successful or is being hidden now.
Right, it's important context about institutional behavior, perhaps, but not proof for this specific hypothesis.
Got it. Let's shift focus again to someone who claims direct, positive experience, Joe McMoneagle.
Right. McMoneagle, featured on The Sean Ryan Show. He presents himself as the U.S. government's first remote viewer. Says he consulted for intel agencies for decades.
And he claims it worked.
Oh, absolutely. He gives numerous examples where he believes his remote viewing was successful. Locating missing kids, identifying classified Soviet submarines, helping in hostage situations. Even remote viewing Mars, he claims.
Wow, those are some pretty extraordinary claims. Mars.
Yeah. So his perspective is obviously very different from the CIA report or the skeptics. He's a firm believer in the reality and the practical power of remote viewing.
Does he think the U.S. was ahead or behind on this?
He actually says the U.S. was late to the game, that the Russians were ahead in using this potential. And he has his own ideas about how psychic functioning works, connecting it to creativity, original thought. Okay. And what's his story about why the official programs ended? If it was so successful, why stop?
He talks about the program moving from Army NSCOM to the DIA and then eventually being shut down. He puts a lot of the blame on political factors, famously quoted as saying something like, "Nobody wants to be caught dead standing next to a psychic."
So the giggle factor, or political embarrassment rather than lack of results.
That's his implication, that there wasn't the political will to openly back something so unconventional, regardless of whether it worked.
Does he give specific examples of successes from his time?
Yes. He mentions things like locating a specific Soviet bomber, accurately identifying a building in Russia. Uses these as a proof the program had real operational value. He also claims he's the only viewer who consistently did viewings under what he calls maximum controls.
Interesting claim. And what's his view on who can do this? Is it a rare gift?
No, he believes the basic ability for remote viewing is inherent in everyone. It's a latent human skill that just needs developing.
Okay, so McMoneagle presents a narrative of a real effective tool, maybe sidelined by politics, not failure. That directly contradicts the CIA's internal findings and the skeptical consensus. It's a stark contrast.
It really is. His perspective is central to the argument that something valuable was achieved and perhaps unfairly dismissed or hidden.
All right, let's round this out with some other perspectives from our sources. Any other key voices or findings?
Well, Dean Radin, who reportedly worked on DIA's project Stargate, is quoted by CBS News saying the program was beyond top secret.
Beyond top secret. That definitely implies a high level of classification, sensitivity, lends some weight to the idea it was taken very seriously, maybe hiding something significant.
It suggests seriousness, yes. But other info kind of balances that. Reports mention the DIA evaluated the unit in the early 90s. And then the CIA shut down the $20 million Stargate project in 1995.
Oh.
And that shutdown was reportedly based on evaluations recommending tighter controls and more critical research, which sounds familiar, right? Echoes the earlier CIA report's concerns.
Right. So even if it was super secret, it was still evaluated and found wanting, leading to termination.
That seems to be the documented path. And even within that evaluation, there was disagreement. Jessica Utz, statistician on the review, apparently saw a statistically significant positive effect. But Ray Hyman, the psychologist and skeptic, wasn't convinced it proved ESP.
So even the official evaluation had internal debate about interpreting the results. It's complex.
Very complex. Then there's the book, The Psychic Battlefield. It digs into the history of military and intel using psychic abilities, including Stargate.
The existence of a book like that, talking openly about Stargate, suggests some level of declassification and public knowledge, doesn't it?
It does. It doesn't settle the debate about effectiveness or concealment, but it shows the topic isn't entirely hidden history. It's being discussed, researched, written about, using declassified info and interviews.
Okay. And one last piece, the Ark of the Covenant remote viewing. What does that tell us?
Forbes reported on that declassified document. It mainly illustrates the sheer range of targets they pointed remote viewers at. Pretty unconventional stuff.
Yeah, definitely unconventional.
And the fact that that session, viewing something so mythical, was declassified and released, it again shows a willingness to be open about some aspects of the program's weird history, even if the results were, subjective and unprovable.
Okay. So let's try to synthesize all this. We've covered quite a bit of ground.
We have. It's a winding path.
We started with the CIA's own declassified assessment, their draft report. And that concluded, basically, that while maybe some weird statistical effects happened in the lab, the program didn't provide reliable, actionable intelligence, and they recommended stopping its operational use.
Right. A fairly negative internal verdict on practical utility.
Then we looked at the skeptical community. They echo those concerns about lack of reliable proof, point to methodological flaws in the research, and see the program's termination as evidence it just didn't work.
Yet their view aligns closely with the outcome described in the CIA report. Failure to deliver.
But, on the other hand, you have personal accounts like Joe McMoneagle's. He claims significant successes, argues it was effective, and suggests politics or embarrassment killed the program, not failure.
A completely different narrative.
Yeah.
One where a valuable tool was potentially discarded for non-scientific reasons.
And we see these programs were highly classified, beyond top secret even, which fuels suspicion.
It does. Secrecy always breeds suspicion.
Yet, at the same time, there's been substantial declassification. Reports, documents, articles, books, a lot of information is out there now, provided by the agencies themselves.
Which seems inconsistent with actively hiding a currently successful, crucial program. Why release all that historical data?
So the picture is, well, complicated, contradictory even. Declassified reports show limitations, lack of reliable intel, anecdotes claim success.
It makes it really hard to definitively conclude, based just on these sources, that there's been this ongoing intentional concealment of a successful psychic espionage program. The bulk of the documented declassified evidence points towards programs that were explored, found limited, and ultimately abandoned.
Right. That narrative exploration, finding limitations, abandonment due to lack of practical results doesn't really fit the motive for hiding a powerful working asset. It might be embarrassing history, maybe, but not necessarily a secret weapon being concealed.
Exactly. The story is definitely multifaceted. Anyone wanting to really form their own conclusion would need to dig deep into those declassified records themselves, weigh the different perspectives critically. It's certainly an intriguing topic.
It really is. Well, thank you for breaking down all that complex information with us today.
My pleasure. It was a fascinating deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.